Hi, welcome to today's webinar all around sustainability or Sustainability 101. My name's Alexis Eyre. I founded a sustainable marketing consultancy called Green Air, but I have worked in the marine industry on and off for the last 10 years for the likes of Sunsail, X-Yachts, Border Boats, so have quite a varied sort of experience in that area. Anyway, today I'm going to run through just the starting knowledge and what you need to know about sustainability. What are the opportunities? What are the risks if you do not adapt to it? And really why we need to do it. So here goes. I'm sorry, just tried to share my screen. I'll be 2 seconds. Okay, right, here we go. So as I said, we're going to be talking about sustainability and how does the marine industry fit into the sort of much wider context that's being discussed so much at the moment. So first of all, I want you to really ask your question. Think about the company that you are in right now and think, is the world better off because of your company's existence? I generally think about that. Like, do you think your company is contributing in a positive way to society and the planet? And do you think, you know, in the future, we will look back and go, God, that company contributed so much? Great question from Paul Polman, the ex-CEO of Unilever, who really led the way in this area. So I'm going to just quickly do a sort of where are we right now and why is there such an urgency for businesses to become sustainable? I'm going to play a quick 2.5-minute clip, which hopefully will kind of set the scene in this area.
Welcome to the Anthropocene, the age of humans. We are now the dominant force of change on the planet.
Nature once determined how we survive. Now we determine how nature survives.
Three-quarters of the land surface and 2/3 of the ocean are impacted by our activities. In the summer, there is 40% less Arctic sea ice cover than there was in 1980. Almost half of our planet's forests have been felled for their timber. And to make space for ourselves and our livestock. And at sea, our extensive overfishing is leading to the collapse of key fish stocks.
The cod stocks crashed back home in Newfoundland, where I was from, and thousands of people thrown out of work, boats beached, canneries emptied, and that was the real wake-up call. That's where I began to understand that there'll be no jobs on a dead planet.
The destruction of our natural world is already costing us trillions of dollars every year. Suddenly, the costs of the age of humans are outweighing the benefits.
We are at risk of entering a danger zone where we could trigger irreversible and self-amplifying change which could push the whole planet ultimately away from the desired equilibrium. We're at risk of destabilizing the whole planet.
We have just 10 years to drastically alter our path before it will be too late to avoid catastrophic changes to our planet.
We need revolutionary speed, right? We need a green revolution, and it needs to happen at the scale and at the speed of the digital and internet and mobile revolution.
And what drove the speed and scale of these revolutions? Business. The same force that powered the last period of global change can also power the next.
The business sector has no option but to be a force for change.
So that really kind of sets the scene. Oh gosh, sorry. So that really kind of sets the scene for how business can be such a key component in helping fight some of these biggest challenges we have. And really like fighting for our survival. I mean, it sounds really drastic, but it generally is along those kind of lines. So I think the two greatest targets that we're really aiming for ultimately are to keep our, the entire global warming below 1.5 degrees, which doesn't sound very much when one day we have frost in the morning and the next day it's like 15 degrees. But actually 1.5 degrees is the average entire planet heating up. And that is the difference between the Arctic ice melting, which means, sea levels will rise, it will cause mass climate change, refugee migration. Also, you're starting to see the unrest, especially in Mali, where it's starting to get really hot and arid. And so this really took off sort of about 50 years ago, but I will go into that in a second. But basically, we're currently on 1.1 degrees. So that is how close we are to even 1.5 and how rapidly we really need to grasp this by the horns and get going with it. And the other area that's really linked, and it's the other big thing that COP26, which I'm sure you've heard about, that was back in a couple of months ago, they basically said 1.5 degrees and biodiversity loss is our biggest challenge right now. And biodiversity is so linked to climate change, but we have lost 50% of our biodiversity worldwide since the 1970s. And if you think, people often think like lions, tigers, when they think biodiversity, but we depend on biodiversity to feed. It's the crops, it's the bees that pollinate our crops. It's the oceans that we fish from. It's the timber that we make our houses from. Like, we literally cannot survive without biodiversity. And so that's why these two areas are just monumental targets that we need to work towards. And every single business and human and individual should be working towards helping, get over these two. So where does the marine industry fit into that? Where does it fit into this entire narrative? Now, ultimately, these are just a few of the examples, but this shows you the scale of the issues that currently exist just within the marine industry alone. So as you all know, the biggest elephant in the room right now is that 30 to 40,000 boats are reaching end of life every single year in Europe alone, not even worldwide. Just think of all that GRP and where it's going. And yes, there are people starting to work on solutions, but I was having this conversation when I was chair of the British Marine Sailing Committee about 7 years ago, and still there's still work to be done in this area. And just think of all the things that that wasted. Waste should not be waste. It's just resource in the wrong place, and that's how we really have to start thinking about things. Everyone always thinks that oil spills come from big tankers. But actually 95% of all the global oil and fuel pollution comes from refueling and maintenance of the everyday boats, from, yachts to fishing boats to power boats. That's actually where most of the oil and fuel pollution is coming from. As I said, linked in with the biodiversity, 50% of our marine life has disappeared since 1980. So it's even worse than the sort of global thing, and we depend on it. It draws down carbon. It provides food to us. It stops hurricanes from hitting, if coral dies, then we don't have those natural sea defenses. It's so crucial, to helping us. 40% of marine litter, everyone always focuses on, where it's coming into rivers out in the, the Far East, but actually 40% of marine litter comes from boat users. It doesn't even come from, the Far East. It comes from the everyday person on their boats, chucking stuff into the water or, accidentally, plastic falling off. The marine industry also accounts for 10% of all the total composite waste streams that are currently coming out at the moment. So just imagine when you go through a boatyard at the moment, like those skips full of just waste going out at the moment. And then 2.7% of the entire global emissions come from the marine industry alone. And yes, quite a lot of that comes from shipping, but we still inherently produce a lot of fumes in the grand scale of being actually quite a small industry in comparison to, some of the other industries out there. So it's time for solutions. What is sustainability like? What is the big deal around it? It's basically finding the optimum balance between environment, society, and economy that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. And I think below shows you quite a good example where we currently sit, with this huge sole focus of companies on commercial, profit, profit, profit. And yet actually, if we really want to carry on living on this planet, we need to actually focus on all three elements. We can't just have our KPIs focus on profit. We need to also be, how are we actually impacting environment, you know, positively, and societal issues positively. But actually, you know, it's almost starting to change the narrative even then from sustainability. It's not about sustaining what we currently have. It's not enough. We actually, you know, 29th of July is Earth Overshoot Day. So that marks the date when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in a given year exceeds what Earth can regenerate in that year. So actually beyond the 29th of July, we predominantly businesses are taking more from the planet than actually can be reproduced each year. And we need to actually get to a stage where businesses are giving back more, we're replenishing, we're restoring, we're regenerating the planet, back to a stage where we're not going into, you know, the sort of disaster zone effectively. This is just a sort of graphic to show you, but that's what we're using at the moment, and it's going up every single year. That date is getting earlier and earlier every single year. So we really need to think how we use our Earth's resources. Kate Raworth, who is an amazing thought leader, she's just extraordinary. She talks at the UN, she talks, you know, she advises governments, but she basically came up with this model called donut economics. And she said, we need to find, you know, our place in that light green area, that sweet spot where, you know, we are supporting our society, supporting people, ensuring we don't overuse water and food, while also not affecting, you know, chemical pollution, ocean acidification, climate change. It's about finding that absolute bit between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation. Is like, that's our sweet spot. That's what we need to hit. That's what every single business needs to hit in order for us to start replenishing and restoring. Now, the interesting thing about this is this photo on the left was literally taken at the Rio Olympics, you know, in the bay where all the sailors were in 2016. And, you know, this has got worse, the situation's got worse. So, and this is on the right where, you know, we want to have a life that's full of, you know, imagine going on a sailing holiday and not seeing any wildlife, like diving off a boat and just seeing dead coral everywhere, not being able to fish, having murky waters full of plastic. I mean, it would kind of change your scenario and what you think is important. So I think it's time to restore and help our planet, like actually regenerate, actually it's like be a force for good rather than just take. The great thing is we already have so many solutions. In fact, actually, we have all the solutions we need to actually restore and replenish. So there's no waiting on, you know, these famous carbon storage technologies that haven't yet been invented. We actually have everything today. And it's now all about putting that into the systems. I mean, who wouldn't? I mean, this is just, you know, there's a wonderful report called the Good Life Report, which has just recently come out, which is basically for marketing people to help them show to their customers what a clean world looks like. You know, it's not about taking things away from people. It's about, you know, thriving businesses, more wildlife, fresh air, like COVID really accentuated that. You know, everyone was talking about how they could walk down a street, especially in like central London, and they didn't smell car fumes. Sort of clean cities, clean boats, you know, an abundance of jobs, and, you know, tastier food because we're not flooding it with fertilizer. So, and, you know, in regard to the marine industry, it's like clean and abundant seas, you know, seas that actually when you go on holiday, you're like, God, this really is magical. Or even out in your everyday, it's not even on holiday, like just going down the river or going out in the Solent, if you go out in the Solent and actually seeing clean water and actually seeing wildlife again back in the Solent, can you imagine? So what is involved in sustainability? Now, this is actually an interesting perspective. Sustainability is often like lumped together with CSR, but there's a fundamental difference. CSR, or corporate social responsibility, is actually a kind of arm. It's a peripheral arm that companies feel that they need to contribute to society, but it's actually not, it's not, that contribution is not connected to the core, to what the actual business means. It's kind of like an element on the side, and funding can stop, it can start again, it can stop. Whereas sustainability is actually like, it sits the heart of every single thing a company says and does. It becomes core to every single business decision. It's like a complete shift in mindset and business strategy. And it's an exciting one. And I'm going to go into why it is. It's not don't see it as a hindrance, see it as like a real business opportunity. But what does that actually look like? Like, what does sustainability look and feel like? So this is, some of the situations that, sustainability will look at. It will look at like the human rights. Have you got human rights through your entire supply chain? Do you know that the metal that goes into your winches has not been mined using child labor? Do you actually know that? Do you actually, actually have checks in place to ensure that? What about the air quality for your entire supply chain? The water quality? Are any chemicals leached into the water? Do your activities impact on biodiversity? You actually like depleting the biodiversity? Again, chemicals leaking into the sea and killing the wildlife around there. And what about the way that you treat your employees? Where do you invest your money? Investing money is a huge perspective within this. So just, something to think about in terms of that. There are so many different elements, and it's around these 3 pillars. Now, this is only the start, but these are the kind of issues that you might be looking at as a company and starting to tackle. So what are the opportunities and risks? Now, this is a really exciting part. Like, why would you want to become sustainable? Well, firstly, it enhances brand reputation. Social media is prolific these days. Everyone obviously knows that, and your brand can be destroyed within seconds. Brewdog being a prime example about 3 months ago. Brewdog the beer, I'm sure you saw it. It hit national headlines when they got caught out on social media. So it can really enhance your brand reputation, but at the same time, they've actually come back and they are doing so much towards sustainability and actively talking about it and educating it. So their brand reputation is like shooting up again because they tackle the situations that were within there. It also increases innovation. And a really good, example of this is Marine Shift 360. And this is a life cycle assessment tool that has been set up by the 11th Hour Racing, one of the supporters of the Volvo Ocean Race, not the Volvo Ocean Race, sorry, the Ocean Race. And they've got loads of partner brands, and it's all around like how pre-competitively can we come up with innovative solutions that help everyone in the industry, like before you go into the competitive nature, how each of you do it differently. But we need that. We need a lot of pre-competitive elements that come together, and actually you're seen in a really positive light from customers if you start to be seen as that catalyst of positive change. And also you'll have access to, those innovations first, which is always going to give you a competitive advantage regardless. By adopting the circular economy, which is basically a model, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the famous sailor, set up this amazing foundation called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Have a look at it. It's all around circular economy. How do you create businesses that mean that nothing goes into landfill, that there is zero waste? Waste, as I said earlier on, is no longer seen as a bad thing. It is just resource put in the wrong place. And, ultimately by doing that, by starting to adopt this sort of circular economic model, you'll be reducing waste and the cost of disposal. I think there's a big problem around, well, the increasing costs on virgin materials have gone through the roof since COVID, but also actually like the Ever Given stopping into the entire supply chain. Circular economy is also around like how to get all that value that you created back into your circuit again, so that you're not having to rely on virgin materials, especially as they become more and more scarce. How do you take that material back in? Like if you produce a boat, how do you get a GRP to be reused to make a new boat in the future? Again, it will cost less to actually use than, mining from virgin materials. And it means you're not having to go miles away to go and source that material. I've done quite a lot in the sustainable insurance sector right now. And trust me, there is a lot coming down the line. I think, insurance companies are really going to start seeing companies that are not set up for sustainability and future-proofing their companies as a real risk to their portfolio. And they'll either end up charging you a lot more if you don't have it in place, or they won't insure you at all, full stop. So just an example, that is coming down the track. But at the moment, you're starting to see these sort of favourable insurance premiums for companies that are already starting to go down that line. Increased employee retention and talent attraction. So at the moment, 30% of the workforce is millennials and under. But by 2025, it is going to go up to around 65%. I can pull out all the sources of information for this. But this starts to show, and the really big interesting thing here is that millennials and younger generations actually want to work with companies who have better environmental and societal credentials, who are actually showing they're being impactful for the good. So even if right now you think it's not a problem, 10,000 baby boomers are retiring a day, and that workforce is becoming younger and younger, and they are looking for different things. As I said, 75% of youngsters are looking for companies that are doing better. So you're just going to lose employees and lose not attracting new talent if you do not start tackling that. Favourable green finance. I also do quite a lot in the sustainable investment world. This is definitely taking force. I'm sure you've seen a rise in ESG and sustainable funds. A lot of greenwashing going on there, but ultimately they are pumping a shed load of money into companies that are more sustainable, and that is going to only increase exponentially, especially as the new regulations kick in as well. So that's something else to think about in the future in case you're looking for investment in finance. Get ahead of governance and current and future taxonomy. As of 2022, April 2022, the UK's biggest companies legislatively have to disclose their impacts on climate change and their strategies in place to how they're going to be tackling that. Now think of those biggest companies and their entire supply chains, and that means all their supply chains are going to be hit by these strategies having to be disclosed. And this is going to be rolled out to more and more companies. So actually, by getting on board now, you're actually getting ahead of what's coming down the track anyway, and it's coming thicker and fast. Align with customers' changing philosophies and values, much like the employees, especially the youngsters coming up through the track. Up to about 70% of them are actually now looking for sustainability credentials before they buy a product. And that is only going to go and increase, unfortunately, as these younger generations become the predominant buying force within society. So again, you've got to think about aligning with their values. Ensuring higher business model efficiencies. By the very nature of adopting circular economy, by adopting other elements of sustainability, you will actually just get better efficiencies regardless of anything else. Increase resilience to future shockwaves. It will help you with future pandemics, because I'm sure there's going to be more at the rate at which they're coming through. Also, like the Ever Given, prime example, one ship blocked the Suez Canal and the entire supply chain system is completely screwed right now. And actually, by the very nature of being more sustainable, kind of tied into the virgin materials thing, you could have actually been much more resilient and not been so shocked by such a big shockwave such as that. Hurricanes are going to be huge in the future. Extreme weather conditions, think Hurricane Irma and the chaos it caused out in the Caribbean for the holidays companies, sailing holiday companies. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. And like, how do you, had other measures being put in place, could, the damage have been a lot less. And increasing profitability. It increases profitability for many different reasons, but that is becoming more and more apparent. And then you sort of flip it on the other side. Like, what's the biggest risk to a business if they do not become sustainable? Well, reputational risk. Ultimately, that is probably the biggest risk you're going to cope. And there are going to be 7 potential risks to revenue if sustainability is ignored, under which reputational risk is the headline factor. It will mean poor reputation on energy and carbon management if you don't have your carbon strategies in place. Water management. We are going to be going through a water shortage soon. Every water company is saying it right now. It's rather hard to believe when England it rains a lot, or the UK it rains a lot, but actually ultimately in the long term, as our populations increase and we consume more and more water, we are going to have water management issues. And that is a wider, as the planet gets warmer, we're going to see more and more of that worldwide. Poor reputation on materials and waste management. Again, where do you get your mined material from? And also, the sort of like the costs of actually, as I said, like waste management in the future as circular economy models are starting to come down through. Poor supplier reputation behaviors. Social media is going to screw you if they find out you've got child labor happening in your entire supply chains now. So just it's kind of thinking along those kind of lines. Poor reputation on ecosystem damage. Think oil spills. Think of chemicals pouring out of your boatyard and someone latching onto that. Again, social media is prolific for highlighting this kind of information. Less competitive prices. Now, also, you've got to really think down the lines of if a company's adopted sustainability and they've started using less and less virgin material, which is ultimately more expensive, and started reusing material that's already out there and already like formed in whatever form, they're going to end up being able to like charge less to their customers. And then you're really starting to actually have a problem against competitiveness going down the line. Now, it might not be that right now, but it will be in the future. and some disruptions in the value chain. Exactly what I say, come back to it time again, ever given. Prime example of that, you know. And also the other element that's going to come is like how COVID in developing countries has hit supply chains from that angle as well, which has caused chaos getting some of that material through. So one area that I was asked to cover, and I know it's absolutely enormous, you know, especially off the back of COP26 and these net zero strategies that everyone is talking about, I thought I'd actually do a bit of like jargon busting and try and like help you understand exactly what carbon means and what you can do to help fight it. So that gives you a context of where we currently are. They keep saying that carbon emissions are through the roof. Firstly, carbon emissions actually isn't just carbon dioxide. Carbon emissions actually accounts for like methane, which is even more deadly than carbon dioxide, although it dissipates a lot quicker. It's actually really lethal. You've got nitrous oxide in there, you know, there's a sort of host of like emissions that sit within it, but that's what they mean when they're talking about carbon emissions. They're talking about sort of a mixture of these. Now, the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning fossil fuels, is when it started. But 1950s, when marketing kicked off, it was the end of the war, absolutely boomed. And although we had a slight dip last year, we're now even higher than 2019. Like, consumption has gone up even more. And it's just, we just can't keep retaining that. In order to halve our emissions, in order to hit that 1.5 degree target, every single company on this planet needs to reduce their emissions by 7.5% every single year until 2030, just to hit the 1.5 degree target. And it obviously needs to continue after that. So that shows you, we need to get this line back to down to as close to 0 trillion tons as we can. And that's, you know, the scale of what we need to do and why every single company needs to jump on board with this. So you might have heard this, you might not have done, but basically carbon emissions are split into 3 scopes, as they're called. The first one is your direct emissions, so scope 1 emissions, and that is the emissions directly related to what your company does. You know, from the emissions released from manufacturing, from company vehicles going around. This is the kind of thing, so anything that is directly released because of what your company does, that is scope 1. Scope 2 is the energy supply you use. So the energy, electricity, gas that you use, that is your scope 2 emissions. And that's often one of the easiest ones to fix, you know, like change your energy supply to a renewable one. That is literally one of the quickest fixes you can do. And then scope 3 is split into 2 areas. You've got your upstream and your downstream emissions. Now, your upstream ones are, you know, your business travel, your employees' business travel. So they're basically all like indirect emissions that are linked to your company, but you do not have literally direct control, as in you can stop and start a manufacturing machine, but you could absolutely have an effect on how they're done. So it could be like where your goods are made. So this is entire supply chain. How much carbon is produced in your entire supply chain until you get the product for the final manufacturing. The transportation and distribution of all the materials to get to your factory. This could also be you know, this could be absolutely anything. I mean, it could be, if you're a holiday company, it could be your food coming in. If you're a winch company, it could be where your metals come from the whole way through the system. You know, there are so many different elements around that. It's also the buildings you lease, the waste generated in operations. So it's everything that happens before the product hits the shelves for the customers. Then you've got all the downstream, you know, like the electricity that your customers use to power your goods. So Pucker Teas discovered that one of their biggest downstream scope 3s was the actual boiling of kettles to make tea by customers. And what could you do to scale down that scope 3? Investments, where you invest your money, processing of sold products, transportation, distribution, once it's left your factory, where does it go from there? Use of sold products, end of life, you've got to consider even end of life and all those. So it is monumental. And I will admit, around 80% of all a company's emissions sit within scope 3. But as I said earlier, with companies, because supply chains sit in scope 3, because these biggest companies are now legislatively having to put net zero strategies in place, otherwise they'll be fined as of next year, think of their entire supply chains all need to become net zero as well. All of their carbon emissions need to be calculated. So when you start putting the context like Unilever is going net zero by 2035, Unilever has 30,000 suppliers who have to become net zero as well, right back to where the raw materials are produced. So that's a scale of how much impact it can have once you get going. So this is you're hearing a lot about net zero and carbon neutral and carbon negative. So this is really the difference between all of them. Net zero is all around reducing your carbon footprint to zero emissions across all three scopes that I've just mentioned. So that's actually having an aggressive carbon emissions reduction strategy in place. It's not about offsetting, it is about actually reducing the carbon emissions that you produce. And only when you get to the very, very final bit, whether you get to the section at the very end where you'll have like 0.01% of emissions that you cannot get rid of through reduction anymore, then you can mitigate them. And that's through a specific certified scheme of carbon removal and storage. So carbon removal and storage I'll go into in a bit, but that's the key. And in the UK, it's legislated that a net zero claim must be accompanied by a plan. So you have to show how you're going to get to it. What are the intermittent targets? So you can say net zero by 2035, but you could say 50% reductions by 2025. And you have to have those intermittent targets in place. And they have to be aligned to science-based targets. So you actually work with a company to come up with science-based targets that show that basically you work towards, and they will do targets across every single scope to say, this is the target you need to hit in order to be able to hit that 1.5 degree sort of ambition that the world is trying to hit. Carbon neutral, on the other hand, is actually about measuring your carbon footprint and then offsetting the entire lot. So legally, it's scopes 1 and 2 and some of 3, i.e. business travel. But best practice means that you offset your entire scope 3 as well. This can be done at any time, so you can literally do this now, and it's often the first step. Companies will often start with carbon neutral and go on to net zero, because it means you're starting to act on your carbon emissions from day one. But it is not the final solution, it's just a stepping stone. Carbon negative is basically carbon neutral, but actually offsetting more carbon than you actually produce. So it's actually going a step further. You've probably heard of this. Microsoft said recently they're going to offset, more than 100% emissions. They're going to offset their entire emissions that have been produced since 1975 when the company was founded. I think it's 1975. It's around there, 1975, 1978. So you'll hear carbon negative starting to kick in, but that is not net zero. We need every single company to get to net zero and as fast as possible. Just a quick analysis between carbon removal and carbon avoidance. Carbon removal is actually drawing carbon out of the sky. So that's like peat bog restoration, huge. They peat bogs. And to think all of that is being dug up and put on compost or gardens, which I love gardens, but it doesn't need to be peat compost. It could be growing, it could be planting trees, is obviously one of the most famous ones that people have latched onto. It could be seagrass restoration. Seagrass, thinking of the marine side of things, and mangroves. They are huge carbon removal and they will draw down a lot of carbon. And that's what you need for net zero. Carbon avoidance is actually where you, instead of removing carbon from the sky, you're actually avoiding future carbon emissions. So you are putting your money into solutions for the future. So solar powered ovens like this in developing worlds could be an example where gas or electricity aren't used. It's not the solar powered electricity, but not fossil fuel driven electricity, and also not burning off logs. So that's a sort of carbon avoidance. So this can be used in carbon neutral, but it cannot be used in net zero strategy. So just so you know the difference between the two. The one other thing as well, there is a lot of talk about carbon. It is absolutely essential. It's our biggest challenge to date. But do not forget that there are so many challenges that we've got out there, and they are all extremely interlinked. But just don't think carbon, tunnel vision with this. When you're going out on a sustainability strategy, carbon is going to be a huge part of it, but it's not the final thing. You have to think about loads of other elements as well, your water usage, overconsumption, like air pollutants, we really got to think like that. So where do you begin with your own sustainability path? So before I go into this, actually, just quickly, I was actually asked just before, some quick wins that you could potentially do. First of all, change your energy supplier to a renewable energy provider. Now, there is a bit of an energy crisis right now, but that is actually a really quick way of getting rid of those scope 2 emissions quite quickly. Start recycling all electronic products. There's the wonderful repair cafes and recycling cafes that basically take in products and repair them and resell them, or they draw the material out of them and sell on that material to, you know, circular economy, as I said, put it back into the system. You can put in, you know, walk to work and cycle schemes, or do incentives towards taking public transport. Put in like light systems that mean that all your office lights are turned off automatically at the end of the day, or machines or anything else that aren't needed, not needed to be running throughout the night, making sure that that element is. You can have a no single-use plastic policy in your office, you know, encouraging people to use reusable water bottles and coffee mugs, and going as far as, if they go out for lunch, taking a reusable container and asking, you know, a cafe or bakery to fill that container rather than giving them more packaging. So there's quite a lot of like simple, well, I say simple, there are quite a lot of things that you can do. Actually, one of the biggest things you can do is, where an individual invests their money, or banks, has 27 times more impact on their individual carbon footprint than everything else they do in its entirety. So whether that's, you know, less plane flights, or whether it's, you know, walking everywhere, or whether it's eating less meat, actually where you invest or bank your money. Now, that impact is a lot less in companies versus individuals, but actually thinking about where your employees' pensions are invested is a huge part that you can think about. And also, where's your business account? What bank is it with? Some good sustainable banks are like Triodos or Starling Bank. But, you know, they're good business account banks, and then the money is actually, you know, being dealt with in a much greener way. So something just to consider as sort of quick wins. But that's not going to actually inherently embed sustainability into your core business strategy, which is basically what you need to drive forward, future-proof your company, make sure it survives in the future. And first of all, you know, they often say, it's like, how on earth can you lose weight if you don't know what your weight is right now? Like, how on earth can you put a plan in place? And it's very much like sustainability. It's like, you need to understand where your greatest impacts are currently before, and, you know, measure them before you can actually start putting a plan in place of how you're going to reduce them if you don't know where your starting post is. So ideally, you would actually go to professional to actually, you know, get a much more thorough, accurate, and sort of professional point of view on this. But if you are to go out, you know, so an example is actually, I'm not bigging up who I, but I am part of a network of consultants, and they do some fantastic work in this kind of area. So, you know, it is something to consider if you want a really thorough job. However, you can do it by yourself. And first of all, you need to identify your impacts. Like, how are you impacting the environment and society? And you really need to do like interviews and workshops with employees, suppliers, investors, board members, customers, also grabbing all that market research and industry insight, and also possibly using a framework like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to really sort of set a narrative and work out where your greatest impacts are. And really, you know, and you'll find that there'll be some little surprises in there, ones that you hadn't considered before. So that is absolutely key. This does take a while, but it's absolutely fundamental. You cannot go anywhere until you've done this initial stage. Also, increase your education in the area. In the future, every single job function is going to have, is going to need sustainability embedded in it. It's going to become inherent. It's going to become core to every single job function out there. So make sure that your staff are starting to, your employees and yourself are starting to educate yourselves on this. Thankfully, it's pretty mainstream these days. So actually, all the national newspapers have sustainability sections. You've also got sort of more focused ones like Business Green and Green Biz. They're great news channels for if you really want like hot sustainability news. There's documentaries. The Water Bear Network is like the free Netflix full of sustainability documentaries. Really interesting stuff going on. You learn a shed load. 2040 is all around what the world could look like in 2040, basically saying all the solutions are already there. It's pretty magical. I actually kind of want to be there already, as long as it goes that way. Kiss the Ground is all around like, without healthy soil, we cannot survive. It's amazing. And actually what we need to do in that place. Chasing Coral is like why coral, how we need to restore our coral more than anything. 60 or 70% of our marine life lives in coral or breeds out of coral, even though it might live in the wide oceans. Quite a lot, it actually, you know, is born in coral to start with. The energy autonomy, the fourth revolution, how, you know, what does a renewable energy system look like? blood in the mobile, that's really just showing you, as I keep on going back to it, it's like, do you know what's happening in your supply chains? And that's pretty harrowing. It's all around like the mobile market. Then you've got some great podcasts out there. You've got Outrage and Optimism. They're brilliant. They have a great three-part series, three-part series, whatever. There's 3 episodes on shipping, and that's just really interesting, just from a marine industry point of view. Sustainababble is quite like a light-hearted, humoured one around sustainability. I listened to a very funny thing the other day about why artificial lawns are so horrendous, but they approach all kinds of things. They produce one every week and have done for like 3 years. There's so much material there to listen to. Future Blue, little personal pimp out here. This was something I set up with someone else through lockdown, and it's approaching like everything you need to know around sustainability and the examples. And we're talking to live examples from the marine industry of companies actually already putting circular economy in place, putting biodiversity at the core of their business strategy in place. We're actually tackling those different areas, as well as getting insight from professionals so you can learn about that particular area of sustainability. And then there's a wonderful thought leadership think tank called Rethink X, which is basically like the role of innovation disruptions on and how it's going to drive so much change in society in the near future. And it is absolutely brilliant. You have to read it. It's like now governments are starting to use some of their research papers to show what's coming down the track, and it's amazing. And then the final thing is make sure you engage everyone from day one. I have seen so many sustainability strategies fall at day one because they did not engage their staff, and so staff weren't really sure what they were doing. They didn't feel particularly enlightened because they weren't involved in the process, and you know it fell at the first hurdle. So just make sure that you engage everyone from day one. And just going back to this, just something to think about. If you produce a product, there's this wonderful quote, and it says, if it can't be reduced, reused, repaired, rebuilt, refurbished, refinished, resold, recycled, or composted, then it should be restricted, designed, or removed from production. That is basically where we're going. Does your company, do the products, if you produce products, does it fit into that top half? And if it doesn't, there are going to be legislations coming down the track that ensure that your company, your product will not survive going forwards. Plus, you just make a shed load more money if you actually think about it from the top half. So going back to the original element, now everything that you've learned, is the planet a better off because of your company's existence? And just think about it now. Now, everything that you've learned, do you generally believe that the world is a better place because of your existence? If you have any more questions or you want more information, just contact me. I can be found at alexis@greenair.com. As I said, I am part of a alliance of sustainability consultants who are like specialists in all kinds of areas like carbon footprinting and circular economy. So if you need any help in any of that area, just get in touch, and I'll see what I can do. Anyway, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to the next one.